Yo, YouTube, what's up? So, today was a very good day. Today, we did a lot of science. I did a lot of science, talked about a lot of science with a friend and as well as my advisor. So, one of the things I was tasked with today, my advisor was just bouncing ideas off of me. She's teaching the class and she wants to come up with an experiment that sophomore to junior and senior level students will be able to conduct within an hour or two times time frame with the Aplysia californica in our grow out room. And one thing that I suggested is doing a experiment on operant conditioning in Aplysia. So operant conditioning has been shown to work in Aplysia, especially using negative reinforcements. The negative reinforcement that I actually use a form of operant conditioning training in Aplysia, where they learn to not go for an inedible food source. And the negative feedback is them not being able to swallow the food source. By them not being able to swallow this food source, they learn that the food source is inedible and therefore will stop going for it. So we understand that operant conditioning works in this animal, and not only learning food is an edible paradigm, the one I use, but also in the siphon withdrawal reflex. Siphon withdrawal reflexes were paired um, in treatment animals and untreated animals. By that I mean when the treatment animals, when they contracted their um, gill to a certain magnitude, then they would get shocked, and so would the untrained animals, even though their gill wasn't retracted. And so the animals that were tracked with a gill retracted at a certain length kept their gill retracted at a certain length longer time. So they learned that being shocked is bad, so they don't want to let their gill expand, right? So therefore, it has been shown that negative reinforcement in operant conditioning works very well in Aplysia. So I suggested an experiment of seeing whether you could do positive reinforcement in Aplysia as well in operant conditioning. It's been shown once, but it wasn't, the way they did it was funny, right? So they talked about the feeding behavior in Aplysia, and 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 they talked about, so in the feeding circuit of Aplysia, the Aplysia will find the food and will bite, and they suggested that just the act of biting is enough as of a positive enforcer that the animal will um, release dopamine and will do it more so if it's stimulated, if the nerves behind the biting are stimulated. And they were able to do that and show that if they stimulate the nerves behind the biting, then it will bite more and stuff like that. But it was, the way they did it was interesting. I don't know the full ins and outs of it. I didn't, not that I didn't understand it, but I didn't gauge what they were really saying about it, because if it is just the act of biting that allows the animal to be positively reinforced, then in my study, in the LFI study, then you would suspect that just the fact that they're biting the inedible food source wouldn't be a negative reinforcement. That would be a positive one, and the animal either wouldn't learn or would continue going for the food source, which we find is not the case. The animal does learn that it is inedible and stops going because of the negative reinforcement of it not being able to swallow, even though it is biting. So you think maybe those two would cancel out, positive plus negative, but we don't see that. So I'm not sure about this particular study, but what I suggested is doing an operant conditioning study in Aplysia, taking a tank and splitting it in half. Have a middle zone, kind of like a middle free zone. Drop the Aplysia in the middle zone, allow it to acclimate to the tank for a couple of minutes, and then see which side of the tank the Aplysia goes to. One side will be a negative reinforcement side, one side will be a positive reinforcement side. If it goes to the negative reinforcement side, we pair this study with the tail withdrawal reflex. And the tail withdrawal reflex, when you depress the animal's tail, it contracts because it is a noxious stimulus, and the animal doesn't like its tail being touched. So it retracts its tail, and eventually it'll loosen and let go and unretract its tail. So we do that on the negative side. If the animal's on the negative side for about a minute, maybe 2 minutes, depress his tail. And then the animal uh, would possibly move, around because it doesn't like its tail being pressed. So waiting, if it's still on that side for another minute, push its tail again. If it's still on that side for another minute, push its tail again. My hypothesis is the animal will move because it doesn't want its tail pressed, possibly to the other side of the tank. On the other side of the tank would be a reward. In this case, I suggested using some ova, a tiny piece of food. So you give the animal a tiny piece of food when it's on the positive side. If it's on the positive side for over a minute, you give the animal a tiny piece of food, let it eat. If the animal stays on that side for another minute, give it another piece of food, let it eat. If the animal moves to the other side, tap its tail. So the animal will learn which side to stay on. Now this in itself is interesting and can be done, but it's not really going to answer the questions that I'm really gauging towards in this study, and that is, can the animal be persuaded, or can the animal learn in a positively enforced operant conditioning experiment, such as being on the left side with the food only, not the right side. We already know that it can learn on a negative reinforcement operant conditioning with, again, LFI, or siphon withdrawal reflex. So I further suggested taking 2 tanks, cutting those 2 tanks in half, putting the Aplysia on one side of each tank. Putting the Aplysia on the side of each tank, and then again, on the left-hand side of the screen, we see that if the Aplysia moves to the left, it goes to the left side of the tank. If it's over there for a minute, give it some food. Presumably, the Aplysia will then, walk around, because you're not going to keep the food there. Give them a tiny piece, let it eat it. Boom. Then, presumably, the Aplysia will roam the tank looking for more food. If it's over on the right side, it's not going to get any food. If it goes back on the left side and it's there for like a minute, boom, give it another little piece, until the animal suspectively would learn that the left side of the tank is where the food is at, so it would stay over there longer. And I would suggest, giving it, when the animal stays on either side of the tank for a period of 10 minutes, then call it, and that animal is done testing for that day, and see which side of the tank it was on more so compared to the other side, versus the negative operant conditioning, where if the animal is on the negative side of the tank, you then depress his tail. And again, if the animal is there for over a minute, you press his tail again, and I would suspect the animal would move around the tank to get away because it doesn't want its tail pressed. If the animal's on the left side, it will not get its tail pressed. And my hypothesis is the animal will learn that the right side is not the good side to go on because he's using his tail pressed, so it'll stay on the left side. I believe this one will work perfectly. This negative reinforcement operant conditioning will work like a charm, like it's supposed to, or like I hypothesized it will work. But I'm not too sure about the positive reinforcement. So big questions here are, first off, can Aplysia learn through positive operant conditioning? There's no telling that it will even work, but can they learn from it? And if they do, which works better in Aplysia? Does the operant conditioning with negative feedback work better, or positive feedback? For instance, in how to tell that, you could say, take the 2 experiments and compare the 2 and say, how long did it take for the animal to learn that it shouldn't be on the right side of the tank, or how long did it take the animal to learn that it should be on the left side of the tank, and see which one of these 2 it will learn quicker from. Therefore, you could say if the animal learned quicker and subsequent other animals learned quicker in one type of training or the other, then that is favored in that animal, and that animal is better in that sort of conditioning. So I proposed that to my advisor. She took a look at it. She didn't say no, so that's a good thing. She thought about it. She goes, that is kind of interesting. She goes, do some more thinking about it, maybe some refinement of the experimental design, and we'll touch base upon this more. And if you think of any other experiments, let me know. So I'm excited, because if that does come through, this is something that I would like to know. Maybe you can train these animals in different ways using food as a reward, how you do like dogs or higher vertebrates. So I'm interested in seeing where this goes. But anyway, that was part of my day. The other part, I talked to a friend about snails and the way their shells are formed, and the opening of either being dextral, which means opening from the right and spinning up, or sinistral, means opening from the left and spinning up. He asked, why do we think that happens? I told him it probably has something to do with the animal's metamorphose and its torsion. So what snails do is, if snails start flat and they have a digestive tract that goes from the mouth, gut to the anus, but halfway through their uh, juvenile lives, this part of their body turns on the top. Therefore, it goes mouth, gut, anus coming out above their mouth. And so I believe it's in this turn, whether it goes to the right or to the left, that will cause the opening of the shell, whether the shell is spinning clockwise or counterclockwise. I don't know this, just it made sense to me. We briefly looked into it, and there's a gene that determines which side the opening of the shell is and the orientation of the spin, but I still don't know. I didn't look deep enough into it to see if torsion was the underlying cause of that, whether the gene actually controls torsion, therefore controlling the spin of it. I don't know, but it'd be interesting to look into. It was just something we were talking about and playing around in our heads, trying to figure out why that is. That also got me thinking, if there is a gene that determines the orientation of the shell spin, then I wonder if there's also a gene that determines hand preference, where humans are either right-handed or left-handed. I wonder if that is a genetic thing as well, and not merely a environmental thing or a thing where you just pick up. Because I had a grandmother who was left-handed, and she went to Catholic school, and they beat it out of her to the point where, like, every time she used her left hand for anything, they would hit her with a ruler. So she later became ambidextrous and can use both hands equally well. I am right-handed, so it didn't come to me, but my daughter is left-handed. So it's interesting. I wonder if it is a gene that perhaps skipped a couple generations and then got into my daughter, or what is behind preferential handedness in humans. Is it the same thing that is behind aperture or shell spin orientation? Anyway, that's my spiel for today. As always, thank you for joining. Peace, love, stay safe on purpose, and we will touch base tomorrow.